Today, we are undertaking an intensive exploration into one of the most painful and truly impactful events in modern Australian history.
We're talking about the Port Arthur Massacre of 1996 and the complicated, tragic life of the man responsible, Martin Bryant.
It's an event that fundamentally and almost immediately reshaped the nation's laws, and you could say its social contract.
Exactly. And our purpose here is to really synthesize the vast body of information we have. Everything from the clinical assessments and detailed timelines to the far-reaching political and legal fallout.
We're trying to understand the full trajectory, the roots of the tragedy, and the unprecedented consequences that followed, not just in Tasmania, but right across Australia.
And we have to navigate this with the utmost respect for the victims and their families. It's so important to state that up front.
Absolutely. 35 people lost their lives that day. 23 others were injured. The suffering was and is immense. Our discussion has to reflect the gravity of that loss.
So we're focusing purely on the facts contained within the extensive records of Bryant's life, the event itself, and the legislative upheaval it caused.
These sources give us a rare, if very disturbing look into the long development of a mass killer. And they reveal crucial, documented warnings and institutional failures that happened years before the tragedy.
Start at the beginning.
Okay, so Martin John Bryant, he was born in Hobart in 1967, the first child of Maurice and Carleen Bryant.
And the family had two homes. They lived between Lena Valley, a suburb of Hobart, and a beach home in a place called Carnarvon Bay.
And here's a truly terrible piece of irony. That beach home was right near the Port Arthur historic site, the eventual location of the massacre.
It is. And what stands out immediately when you look at his mother's recollections is this consistent theme of him being different.
Yeah.
And his destructive behavior. It was noted almost from infancy.
She described him as an annoying and perpetually different child.
Right. And even as a toddler, he showed this inability to play normally. The sources say he would frequently just destroy his toys instead of, engaging with them.
That's not just childhood restlessness, is it?
No. It really suggests a fundamental difficulty with interaction, maybe even with empathy, right from the very start.
And that early pattern led to professional consultation remarkably early on.
It did. The sources mention a psychiatrist who examined a young Bryant and delivered a really stark assessment. He told the family that due to his aggravating behavior, he would likely never be capable of holding down a stable job.
That's a powerful statement. It's an indication that his behavioral challenges were seen as severe and long-standing decades before the massacre itself.
Absolutely. And his abnormal conduct, it was visible outside the home, too.
Right. Locals recalled several incidents. The sources mention him pulling a snorkel away from another child while they were swimming.
And something more indicative of a disregard for others' property. There are records of him deliberately cutting down trees on a neighbor's land, seemingly without any provocation.
And then, at age 12, there was that significant firework accident. It was serious enough to require hospitalization at the Royal Hobart Hospital.
So these difficulties were, you can imagine, magnified in the academic environment. He started primary school at the Friends School in 1973.
And the reports from teachers are universal. They described him as disruptive, sometimes violent, and that he was severely bullied, which often seemed to make his poor conduct even worse.
And crucially, the teachers noted something deeper than just bad behavior or social struggles. They described him as distant from reality and consistently unemotional.
That detachment, that's a huge red flag in psychological development, isn't it?
It is. The inability to properly perceive or respond to emotional cues, either his own or those of other people. It's a profound deficit.
And that behavioral deterioration, it escalated sharply in his preteen years.
Yes. After a suspension from Newtown Primary School in 1977, psychological assessments revealed some deeply disturbing patterns. Specifically, it was noted that he tortured animals.
And while his behavior apparently improved slightly the following year, he continued to show aggression, particularly teasing younger children.
So by 1980, he was so profoundly impaired that he was transferred to a special education unit at Newtown High School. And from there, his academic and behavioral slide just continued until he left the system altogether.
Which brings us to the complex field of diagnosis, the attempts by professionals to really categorize the nature of his impairment.
Right. When he left school in 1983, the process of applying for a disability pension began, and that initiated further and really crucial professional analysis.
And there's one psychiatrist note from that time that is just profoundly indicative. It says, cannot read or write. only his parents' efforts that prevent further deterioration. Could be schizophrenic, and parents face a bleak future with him.
And the sources confirm a clear intellectual limitation. A post-massacre examination by forensic psychologist Ian Joblin found Bryant to be borderline mentally disabled.
He had a measured IQ of 66.
Right. And to give that some context, that places him just above the clinical definition of an intellectual disability. It suggests a cognitive capacity that's generally equivalent to that of an 11-year-old child.
That's a vital piece of the puzzle. His ability to navigate complex social situations, to understand consequences, or exercise mature judgment was severely compromised.
But the clinical picture wasn't simple. And as he awaited trial, the professional opinions varied, which is often the case with complex antisocial behavior.
A court-appointed psychiatrist, Ian Sale, offered a multifaceted diagnosis. He suggested a mixture of conduct disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity, and Asperger's syndrome.
So let's just quickly unpack that. Conduct disorder involves these repetitive, persistent patterns of behavior where the basic rights of others or major social norms are violated.
Which is exactly what we saw with the animal cruelty and the property destruction.
Exactly. And Asperger's, which is now considered part of the autism spectrum, speaks to profound difficulties with social interaction, understanding nonverbal cues. This view paints a picture of someone who is both behaviorally aggressive and socially incapable.
But then you have the counterpoint, the diagnosis from defense psychiatrist Paul Mullen.
Right. Mullen agreed Bryant was socially and intellectually impaired, but his ultimate conclusion differed significantly. He stated Bryant was not mentally ill.
He rejected the idea of schizophrenia or a severe mood disorder.
Yes, instead labeling him a distressed and disturbed young man. And that distinction, not mentally ill, holds enormous legal and social weight.
It does, because if he wasn't legally mentally ill at the time of the crime, he was fully culpable for his actions, regardless of his low IQ or his severe social deficits.
And this debate really highlights the difficult intersection between clinical definitions and the legal standard for culpability and criminal responsibility.
This complexity just makes the documented warning that came before all this that much more chilling. We have to address the explicit note that was attached to his disability pension reassessment paperwork in the 1990s.
This document, it should serve as a profound lesson in institutional failure and the danger of dismissing threats.
Years before the massacre, the note warned that his parents needed to prevent further deterioration because he was continually threatening violence.
And then the explicit quote from Bryant himself, recorded by a professional. He would like to go around shooting people.
The ultimate conclusion of that professional assessment was unambiguous. It said it would be unsafe to allow Martin out of his parents' control.
The significance here is just immense. Homicidal ideation, the specific method shooting people, and the assessment of extreme danger were all recorded. They were known to the authorities and the medical system years in advance.
So the resources and the framework to contain this threat clearly failed. It allowed a known, identified risk factor to continue living unsupervised and unmonitored.
And that failure of the institutional system to act on that explicit warning. Well, it leads us directly into the strange circumstances of Bryant's adulthood.
This is where he suddenly acquires the means and the opportunity to realize those dark fantasies. How did this intellectually impaired, angry young man gain autonomy and the financial resources he lacked?
That connects directly to his unusual and pivotal relationship with Helen Mary Elizabeth Harvey.
In early 1987, Bryant was 19. He met Harvey, who was a 54-year-old heiress to the Tattersall's lottery fortune. He was just looking for lawn mowing work.
And she took him on, befriended him, and he rapidly became a regular at her vast but severely neglected mansion in Newtown.
The sources paint a picture of extraordinary squalor and eccentricity.
They do. The mansion housed 14 dogs inside.
Yeah.
40 cats living in the garage. This neglect was so severe that in June 1990, health authorities had to intervene.
Which resulted in the urgent hospitalization of both Harvey and her elderly mother, Hilza, who died shortly after.
The cleanup was massive. Bryant's own father had to take extended leave from his job just to help clear the property, and the RSPCA removed the animals. This whole chaotic event solidified Bryant's position.
Harvey, apparently grateful for his help and reliant on his presence, invited him to move in with her.
And that cemented their relationship as this unusual, often inappropriate partnership of patronage. And this patronage enabled a life for him that was completely detached from the social consequences of his behavior.
Fueled by Harvey's wealth, the spending was incredible. The sources say they purchased over 30 new cars in less than 3 years. They were frequently changing them after just minor issues or dissatisfaction.
Their days were spent shopping, having expensive lunches at local restaurants. This extravagance served as a kind of physical shield, ensuring Bryant never had to face the social or economic pressures that might have forced him to, assimilate or seek genuine help.
But this environment of unrestrained indulgence only amplified his aggressive tendencies.
Yes. In 1991, they moved to a 29-hectare farm called Torresville in a place called Copping, which Harvey purchased. And his behavior there became actively menacing toward the community.
The neighbors at Torresville lived in fear. They reported that Bryant constantly carried an air gun, roaming the surrounding properties late at night to shoot at barking dogs.
And he even fired it at tourists who dared to stop at a roadside stall to buy apples. The sources make it clear. Residents avoided him at all costs, despite his occasional attempts to appear friendly.
So the inherited wealth allowed him to terrorize a community without any real consequence.
And this strange, dangerous cohabitation ended abruptly on October 20, 1992.
Helen Harvey, aged 59, was killed, along with 2 of her dogs, when her car crossed onto the wrong side of the road and collided violently with an oncoming vehicle. Bryant was a passenger and sustained severe injuries. He was in the hospital for 7 months.
Now, the police investigation into the accident was brief, but it was necessary. It was prompted by alarming evidence about Bryant's known habit of lunging for the steering wheel while Harvey was driving.
It was a consistent, dangerous behavioral tic.
So consistent that Harvey had reportedly told acquaintances she intentionally kept her speed below 60 kilometers per hour, specifically to mitigate the risk of a fatal accident if Bryant grabbed the wheel.
And the alleged statement she made to a neighbor is profoundly unsettling.
It is. She allegedly said, "One of these days, the little bastard Bryant is going to kill me." So while the incident was ultimately ruled an accident, the documented context clearly suggests a life lived on the precipice of danger because of Bryant's lack of impulse control.
The immediate outcome for him was financial security. Bryant was the sole beneficiary of Harvey's will. He inherited assets valued at more than AU $550,000.
However, this wealth immediately triggered an intervention. His mother successfully applied for and was granted a guardianship order which placed his assets under the control of public trustees.
And that was due to his officially diminished intellectual capacity and what they called his vaguest notions of financial management.
That guardianship order is a critical institutional detail. It acknowledged he was unfit to manage large sums of money, yet the tragedy had already given him the security and independence that eliminated any need for him to seek employment or social integration. The financial vacuum was filled, but the social and psychological vacuum that remained.
And just 2 months later, a second tragedy struck, this time involving his father. Maurice Bryant, aged 60, was found dead in a dam at the Copping property.
He had been struggling emotionally, he'd been prescribed antidepressants, and he had subtly transferred his joint accounts and utilities into his wife's name shortly before his death.
On August 14, 1993, a note saying, "Call the police," was discovered pinned to the door of a farmhouse, and several $1,000s were found inside Maurice's car.
After a 2-day search, divers located his body in the dam closest to the house. And the detail here is stark. He had a diving weight belt fastened around his neck.
While the police described the death as unnatural, it was ultimately ruled a suicide.
So the rapidity of these 2 deaths, both under suspicious circumstances involving the only people providing him with any structure or companionship, resulted in Bryant inheriting a second major sum, AU $250,000, from his father's superannuation fund.
So despite being financially independent, even wealthy, Bryant was now completely alone. His social awkwardness, which had been cushioned by Harvey's eccentricity and his father's management, became immediately apparent.
Right. He sold the Copping farm, but he kept the Newtown mansion. And his attempts to project a successful image only highlighted his detachment.
He began dressing in these increasingly eccentric outfits: a gray linen suit, a cravat, lizard-skin shoes, a Panama hat, carrying a briefcase. He was telling people he was a high-paying businessman.
He also favored an electric blue suit with flared trousers and a ruffled shirt for dining out. And there's an anecdote from a restaurant owner he frequented that captures the true state of his isolation perfectly.
What did they say?
The owner noted the general reaction to Bryant's attempts at connection. They said, "It was horrible. Everyone was laughing at him, even the customers. I really felt suddenly quite sorry for him. I realized this guy didn't really have any friends."
So the wealth provided a stage, but only for ridicule.
Exactly. And this profound loneliness drove him to desperately seek connection, even if it was artificial. Between 1993 and 1995, he took 14 overseas trips. He racked up 3 pages of domestic airline summaries.
But he reported feeling just as lonely traveling as he did at home. He enjoyed the flights, though, because the passengers sitting next to him had, in his words, no choice but to be polite.
He could speak endlessly to a captive, if unwilling, audience. But this artificial connection was entirely insufficient. His psychological state deteriorated sharply.
He became suicidal. He stated he'd had enough, feeling that more people were against me. When I tried to be friendly toward them, they just walked away.
And his self-medication, particularly with alcohol, accelerated dramatically in the final 6 months.
Although he was sober during the massacre itself, his daily consumption before the event had climbed to half a bottle of Sambuca, a bottle of Bailey's Irish Cream, plus port wine and other sweet alcoholic drinks.
This severe consumption suggests a final accelerated spiral into despair, self-pity, and destructive planning.
And it was during this period of absolute isolation and despair that the long-dormant threat, that desire to go around shooting people, documented years earlier, resurfaced.
Right. Bryant stated that the plan for the massacre first occurred to him somewhere between 4 and 12 weeks before the event on April 28, 1996.
So let's transition now to the timeline of the attack itself, an event characterized by both premeditation and chaotic, indiscriminate violence.
And the sources provide conflicting accounts of his exact motivation. One was simple attention-seeking, the alleged statement that he would do something that will make everyone remember me.
But the source of the idea, the specific idea, seems to be linked to media events. Dr. Paul Mullen, the defense psychiatrist, suggested the recent Dunblane massacre in Scotland was the specific catalyst.
That had happened just weeks earlier. It was the first mass school shooting in Britain. Bryant allegedly followed Dunblane closely in the news.
Mullen argued that before Dunblane, Bryant was only contemplating suicide. But the media coverage of the killer, Thomas Hamilton, allegedly changed everything. It provided him with a framework and a methodology for destructive action.
So the violence did not begin randomly. It started with specific personal revenge.
The first victims, David and Noeline Martin, they owned the Seascape bed and breakfast. And they were targeted because they had successfully purchased the property, beating Bryant's father in the bidding process years earlier.
And Bryant harbored this deep, specific, and disproportionate grudge. He believed the Martins bought the property purely out of spite toward his family, and that this loss caused the depression that drove his father to suicide.
It was this perceived grievance that initiated the horrific sequence of events.
Bryant drove to the Seascape guest house and fatally shot the Martins. He then stole their weapons, which he needed to augment his own arsenal, and the property keys, and drove the very short distance to the Port Arthur Historic Site, a major tourist destination and a place he knew from his childhood.
His arrival at the historic site demonstrates this chilling blend of the mundane and the monstrous. He paid the entry fee for the site. He parked his yellow Volvo 244.
He then entered the Broad Arrow Cafe, carrying a large blue sports bag which contained his weapons. He sat down and ate a meal on the veranda.
And before launching the attack, he attempted to engage with strangers. He commented on the lack of wasps and the scarcity of Japanese tourists. These are the last recorded interactions of a severely isolated man attempting to blend into normality before unleashing terror.
Once finished, the shift was immediate. Bryant moved toward the rear of the cafe. He placed a video camera on an empty table, a final nod to that attention-seeking motivation, retrieved his Colt AR-15 SP-1 carbine, a semi-automatic rifle, and began firing from the hip at patrons and staff.
The efficiency of the attack is horrifying. It speaks directly to the lethality of the weapon he used.
The sources confirmed that within a mere 15 seconds, he fired 17 shots.
And those 17 shots killed 12 people and wounded 10 in that single blast.
He then moved to the other side of the cafe, fired 12 more times, killing 8 more people and wounding 2. He paused to change magazines, a swift action made possible by the weapon's design, and then he fled.
In that single enclosed space, 20 people were killed and 12 were wounded. The sheer, overwhelming, destructive capacity on display here is a critical element in understanding the political response that followed.
And the violence didn't end with the cafe attack. It immediately became a protracted rampage.
Driving away in his Volvo, Bryant shot at people in the car park and from the moving vehicle, killing an additional 4 people and injuring 6 more.
He then drove just 300 meters down the road and stopped. He encountered a woman walking with her 2 young children.
He shot and killed the woman and the child she was carrying. The older child attempted to flee, showing desperate courage, but Bryant chased her down and killed her with a single shot.
The ruthlessness of targeting a mother and her children just magnified the sense of indiscriminate evil across the entire community.
His actions continued to escalate in chaos. He stole a gold BMW 7 Series by killing all 4 of its occupants. A short distance later, he stopped beside a couple in a white Toyota.
He forced the male occupant into the boot of the BMW at gunpoint. After closing the boot, he fired 2 shots through the windscreen of the Toyota, killing the female driver.
The rampage finally concluded back at the Seascape guest house. Bryant returned, he set the stolen BMW alight, and took his male hostage inside the guest house where the Martins' bodies still lay.
So this was the locus of his initial grievance, and this is where the siege began. The police siege lasted 18 agonizing hours. Officers attempted negotiations for most of that time.
And his demands were highly specific and unusual. He wanted transport via an Australian Army helicopter to an airport.
The sources indicate that communication ended when the battery in the phone he was using died. And crucially, at some point during these negotiations or shortly thereafter, Bryant killed the male hostage inside the house.
The siege ended the following morning. Bryant set fire to the guest house, likely attempting to escape amidst the flames and smoke.
He was captured as he fled the burning building, suffering burns to his back and buttocks. He was taken immediately to the Royal Hobart Hospital under heavy police guard. And this closed the door on the violence, but opened the long chapter of legal and political fallout.
Following his capture and treatment for his injuries, Martin Bryant was judged fit to stand trial. His trial was scheduled for November 1996.
Initially, he pleaded not guilty to the 35 counts of murder and numerous other charges. However, his court-appointed lawyer, John Avery, executed a crucial strategic move.
He successfully persuaded Bryant to change his plea to guilty on all charges.
And this decision prevented what would have been an emotionally devastating and extremely high-profile trial. It would have required dozens of victims and witnesses to publicly recount the horrors they had survived or witnessed.
It offered a measure of closure, though controversial to the community.
The sentence, delivered by Hobart Supreme Court Judge William Cox on November 22, 1996, reflected the staggering scale of the crimes. Bryant was handed 35 life sentences, plus an additional 1,652 years in prison.
And the sentences were explicitly ordered to be served concurrently, defined as for the term of his natural life, which unequivocally denied any possibility of parole.
His imprisonment began in absolute isolation. For the first 8 months, he was held in a purpose-built suicide prevention cell in solitary confinement.
This isolation was deemed necessary not just for his own protection against self-harm, but also for his protection from other inmates, given the nature and notoriety of his crimes. He remained in protective custody until November 2006.
In 2006, he was moved to the Wilfred Lopes Center in Hobart, a secure mental health unit operated by the Tasmanian Department of Health and Human Services.
That's a specialized 35-bed facility designed for inmates with serious mental illnesses.
Right. And while the interior allows for more free movement than a standard prison block, the external security remains maximum level. It's enforced by a triple-wall perimeter and private contract guards.
But even within these secure environments, his volatile behavior has led to incidents. In 2003, another inmate sprayed him with cleaning solution, which required a transfer to the Royal Hobart Hospital.
And his self-harm attempts have been documented multiple times, including slashing his wrist and throat with razor blades in March 2007, which necessitated further hospitalization. He currently remains housed in the maximum security Risdon prison near Hobart.
Now, the immediate, intense media coverage following the massacre created a powerful cultural shockwave, but it also immediately raised some profound questions about journalistic ethics and the integrity of the legal process.
This event became a textbook example of how media sensationalism can potentially prejudice a fair trial. The most criticized and arguably damaging practice was the manipulation of photographs.
The Australian newspaper and several other media outlets published photographs of Bryant where his eyes had been digitally altered, specifically to make him appear deranged and glaring at the viewer.
It was a clear attempt to depict him as a recognizable monster before the legal proceedings had even concluded. And disturbingly, these manipulated photos continued to be utilized by media outlets for a decade, cementing a public image that was intentionally distorted.
There were also concerns that some of these images may have been illegally obtained from his home after it had been sealed off by police.
The legal system reacted swiftly to this perceived contempt of court. Tasmania's Director of Public Prosecutions issued warnings and writs against several major organizations, including the Australian, the Age, the Hobart Mercury, and the ABC.
The argument was that the sensationalist coverage undermined Bryant's right to a fair trial, irrespective of the overwhelming evidence against him.
And the media pushed back forcefully. This ignited a significant national debate about the legal framework itself. The chairman of the Australian Press Council at the time, David Flint, argued that since newspapers frequently ignored contempt of court provisions due to the immense public interest, it was the law, not the journalists, that needed updating.
So he was suggesting this change would just reflect the evolving reality of modern reporting.
Right. But critics rightly feared it could open the door to unchecked trial by media. The entire affair really underscores the struggle between the public's right to information and the legal system's need for due process during a national trauma.
And the event's grip on the national psyche remains strong. It filters into art and culture.
It does. In 2012, a Sydney artist, Rodney Popple, won the prestigious AU $35,000 Glover Prize for a landscape painting depicting Port Arthur with Bryant holding a firearm in the foreground, a move that sparked immediate controversy about glorification versus artistic commentary.
And more recently, the 2021 film Nitram, directed by Justin Kurzel, explored the details of Bryant's life leading up to the massacre, choosing to depict the isolation and background rather than the violence itself.
Yes, and Caleb Landry Jones, who portrayed Bryant, won the Cannes Film Festival Award for Best Actor. This continued focus demonstrates the enduring, complicated, and often controversial cultural reflection on this singular tragedy.
Now, while the background and the legal proceedings are essential, the singular most defining global consequence of the Port Arthur massacre was the immediate revolutionary political response regarding firearms legislation.
This event fundamentally redefined Australia's approach to public safety.
The massacre acted as the undeniable catalyst for change. The Australian government, led by then Prime Minister John Howard, moved with unprecedented speed and bipartisan cooperation.
Within just 12 days of the attack, the government secured the agreement of all state and territory governments to implement extensive firearms restrictions. This consensus was a monumental political achievement. It showed extraordinary national unity in the face of crisis.
The legislative mechanism was the National Firearms Agreement, or the NFA, and the new laws were comprehensive. They specifically targeted the types of rapid-fire, high-capacity weapons Bryant used.
Key restrictions included the restriction or outright banning of semi-automatic centerfire rifles, repeating shotguns capable of holding more than 5 shots, and high-capacity rifle magazines.
Additionally, limitations were placed on low-capacity repeating shotguns and rimfire semi-automatic rifles.
So the legislation effectively created this massive, coordinated national scheme that standardized gun control laws across all jurisdictions. It ended the patchwork of state regulations, which meant the easy availability of the tools used at Port Arthur was drastically curtailed.
This action was not without political risk. While public opinion quickly shifted to support the reform, the government faced significant backlash from gun owners and lobby groups, particularly in rural areas where gun ownership was a long-standing cultural tradition.
Prime Minister Howard took enormous political capital and put it on the line. He notably participated in public rallies where he faced direct threats and hostility from gun rights activists.
But the overwhelming horror of the Port Arthur event provided an ethical and political mandate that just steamrolled most organized opposition, allowing the policy to move forward.
The centerpiece of this reform was the compulsory gun buyback and amnesty program. Using funds raised by a temporary levy on Australian citizens, the government funded the purchase of weapons that were surrendered under the new laws.
The scale was massive. It was logistically complex. The government collected and subsequently destroyed over 1 million privately owned firearms.
And to appreciate the impact, this acquisition amounted to an estimated 1/3 of the entire national stock of firearms in civilian hands. It's virtually unmatched in the history of Western democracies, this rapid, comprehensive, and enduring disarmament following a single event.
And the sources confirm the lasting impact. The policy remains overwhelmingly popular decades later and has demonstrably altered the landscape of mass violence in Australia. The speed, the scale, and the political consensus achieved make this a critical case study in how national policy can pivot dramatically when political will aligns with overwhelming societal trauma.
So reflecting on the sources we've analyzed, the narrative of Martin Bryant is a tragic study in institutional negligence meeting opportunity.
You see this consistent, documented trajectory of a profoundly disturbed individual.
Right, marked by early psychological warnings, explicit threats of mass violence recorded years prior, and this confluence of severe severe mental impairment with sudden inherited wealth that stripped away any remaining social structure or accountability.
And then the event itself, staggering in its efficiency, facilitated by the easy access to high-capacity weaponry. Yet the ultimate institutional response was one of powerful correction, fundamentally changing national policy almost overnight.
And this leads us to our final contemplation for you. The Port Arthur massacre occurred in a geographically isolated location, perpetrated by a deeply isolated individual. In a world plagued by mass violence, why did this specific tragedy, in a single remote Australian town, serve as the definitive tipping point for such comprehensive, politically enduring national reform regarding civil liberties and public safety?
Consider the contrast between the documented early failures, the inability of the system to manage the threat of the individual, and the ultimate success of the political system to collectively manage the availability of the means of the attack. What does this tell us about where societies place their priorities and the conditions necessary for rapid structural change?
We encourage continued thoughtful exploration of the sources and the history of this tragic day.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you.